Hey, so this is going to be a Whatifalthist reaction video to his recent video made, I believe, earlier today, called Are We the New Weimar? Of course, referring to Weimar, Germany, which was, for those of you who don't know, the period right before Hitler took over Germany, and also after World War One. The reason I'm choosing this video, which seems a little bit odd, is because I actually am currently reading a book about the early years of the Weimar Republic and the ascent of Hitler, mostly because it is incredibly fascinating. It's one of the most interesting time periods in history, even though it led to one of the most horrific time periods in history. So, and that's why it's a thing I think that's interesting to study, because people always try to claim that, the next Hitler is on the verge of, making his ascent. And also, I just recently watched one of my favorite movies called Hitler: Rise of Evil, which was a 2002, I believe, Canadian miniseries. And FYI, it does not glamorize Hitler. Okay, it's completely and totally focused on making sure that it just focuses on all the circumstances in Weimar Germany that led to the rise of Hitler, and how how Hitler gradually accumulated power. And that's the same thing in the book that I've been reading about the early years of Hitler. And if you want to find the movie, it used to be on YouTube. Now it's on Amazon. You have to watch commercials, but if you have an Amazon account, you can watch it for free with a few commercials. Nothing too bad at all. And trust me, if you have any interest in history, you will like it. But anyways, that's why I'm choosing to react to this video, and why, because I've always found this period of history kind of interesting, why I think it's something I can make a pretty good response to. And now going to Whatifalthist in his video, he focuses on the fact that Weimar Germany, before Hitler took over, was a little bit more liberal than, I guess you could say, before then, under the Kaiser, or after when Hitler took over. And that's not an exaggeration. I mean, needless to say, a center-left democracy is in general a little bit more leftist in its social beliefs than Nazis or a monarchy. I mean, that's not a very, I can't really explain to you all of that, but I think that kind of goes without saying. However, I'm going to make the case to you why that had really very little to do with the rise of Hitler, and why it was more economic, social, political, and global factors that really led to the rise of Hitler, and why the United States is not currently Weimar Germany. Which does actually bring me, though, to my first point, which is one of the few areas I do agree with him on. There are a lot of liberals that constantly try to portray the modern United States as Weimar Germany in the 21st century, in the sense that they think any second we're about to be taken over by another Nazi like Trump, and the whole scene of that will replay itself, except with the United States, where some Nazi will come to power and declare, take absolute power and kill off all the liberal journalists and start a world war, yada yada. And that's, I mean, there are nationalists, but again, I agree with him in that's a thing that liberals constantly try to portray us as, and I don't think that's the case at all. Because, well, I'm about to get into it. That's kind of a complicated explanation. But going back to Germany now, back in the 1920s, well, let's start, of course, just from the beginning. It may be kind of obvious to some, but some people don't realize just how much Germany lost from World War One. I mean, in addition to the tremendous casualties, millions and millions killed, and many more wounded and traumatized for life, like Hitler, who suffered severe PTSD from his experiences, were very, I mean, people were furious in Germany after they lost. They had sacrificed so much for it. Yet the Treaty of Versailles carved Germany up, lost all of its colonies abroad, and it imposed severe military restrictions on Germany. And in a way, it left the Germans embittered, and it left them also gunning for another fight. In fact, that's what most sensible leaders during the Treaty of Versailles, who are not totally biased, said, is that this is basically just a ceasefire for the next World War. And it's just, stupid and barbaric. I believe John Maynard Keynes, the economist, was the one who was also very critical of it. Well, he was there to watch some of it. And then some, like the American leader Woodrow Wilson, was very critical of it. But the French leader, whose name I can't pronounce, He was, the one who was the primary instigator of it all. But anyways, of course, then afterwards, Germany also did suffer some major economic problems as well. They had hyperinflation, and they were forced to repay most of the war indemnities and were blamed for the cause of World War I, which also greatly financially burdened Germany. This, in and of itself, was enough to leave Germans infurious, leave them ripe for nationalist movements. And of course, that's what led to some things like the Putsch, which is where Hitler and some other right-wing factions in the 1920s tried to overthrow the government and seize power, but they failed. It was kind of complicated as to why they failed. Like, some of it was internal divisions, and some of it was also just that there wasn't as much popular support for them as they thought there were. But like, Commissar von Kahr, I believe, was one of the ones who betrayed Hitler in that, though the exact details of that I'd have to reference, because it's been a long time since I read about it. But anyways, yeah, there was a lot of feelings of nationalism in Germany, and also, there was left-wing nationalism in the form of communism as well, not just right-wing nationalism. There was a brief attempt of the communists to take over Germany's government, which failed ultimately. And there was, of course, mass fighting between the Nazi brown shirts and, not Nazi brown shirts, I'm sorry, the SA, the brown shirts, which were a right-wing militant faction led by Ernst Röhm, and then, of course, the communist leaders, who were also militant as well. Essentially, Germany was just a really battered place after World War I in the Weimar Republic. It probably was not ready for democracy at that time. That's probably not going too far, looking at the things that were going on. However, I don't really, whereas Whatifalthist will try to make the case that nihilism, social liberalism, like how women dressed in the 1920s as opposed to before then, and other social policies like arts, like architecture, like just basically a little bit of what he described as a more liberal era in Germany's history socially, was the cause. And I don't understand how he could see that as being a bigger cause than some of the factors that I just listed that had happened with the Germany's loss after World War I, or then what started happening later in the 1920s, even after the hyperinflation and even after Germany had those tremendous losses. There were a lot of nationalist movements, but Hitler and the Nazis remained mostly a small force politically. And they had the backing of some key political leaders like Paul von Ludendorff, Erich von Ludendorff, no, Paul von Hindenburg was the other one, sorry, I get them mixed up. Erich von Ludendorff, who in the early years supported the Nazis, though he parted ways with them as time went on. And he was a famous general from back in World War I, for those of you that don't know. But, the Nazis still remained a minority. However, that started changing as time wore on, and one of the biggest factors in that was the Great Depression. The Great Depression, well, I wish I could explain this better to you, because I actually don't understand it myself. One thing I've almost always heard from back in my finance classes and anything I've ever heard on economics was that it did actually affect Germany worse in many ways than it even did the United States, Britain, or France, which probably even further, well, not probably, it definitely fueled Hitler's rise to power. And it's obvious looking how the Nazis' representation in the Reichstag, which was Germany's parliamentary body, increased exponentially after the Great Depression. Hitler himself increased exponentially in his popularity. The Nazis' repeated attempts to undermine the Reichstag and to continually kind of basically try to foment rebellion in it, and as well as the SA and the SA and their efforts to foment insurrection abroad with their violent fighting were what kind of also helped propel Hitler into power. But the Great Depression was a huge factor in it, and that's what essentially led Hitler to becoming more mainstream and the Nazis to becoming mainstream. And once Hitler was appointed chancellor, then it was really only a matter of time till he consolidated power and took it away from Paul von Hindenburg, who was at the time the president of Germany and still more powerful than Hitler. but he was aging and his judgment wasn't very good and he was easy to take advantage of. But essentially, there was a lot of unique factors that led to the rise of the Nazis. In fact, another topic related to this that I wanted to talk about quickly was, I kind of like this one book called Nietzsche and the Nazis, which is by Stephen Hicks, where he discusses, was it, philosophical factors that led to the rise of the Nazis? Was it always going to happen? And I actually, though Stephen Hicks is much smarter than me, I actually have the gall to disagree with him a little on this. I do not believe there was anything inherent about Germany or philosophers at the time that would have led to the rise of Hitler in Germany. I believe it was 100% based on very unique circumstances that only affected Germany at that time, because this is a topic that perplexes people, how a extremely developed, educated, and generally more reasonable country like Germany turned to the most evil leader in all of history and went on a genocidal rampage, starting a world war, the Holocaust, and all of that. Well, again, desperate times lead to desperate measures, and that's essentially what led the Germans down the road to their fatal attraction to Hitler. And, once Hitler had consolidated absolute power, there wasn't a whole lot they could do at that point. At that point, once Hitler signed the Enabling Act, which basically granted him absolute power and turned Germany into a police state, if you had qualms about Hitler up to that point, well, it was too late, Sorry, there's some kind of weird storm or something outside, like it's blowing leaves against my window. It sounds really weird. But anyways, I don't know if you can hear that, but sorry if you can. It's a little bit annoying. Where was I? Yeah. But back to, going to the rise of Hitler, Whatifalthist in his video, it's pretty simple what he makes the case for it. He makes the case that it was social degeneracy, and he, of course, compares it to what he considers social degeneracy in the United States that led to the rise of Hitler. And, of course, he's probably trying to make the case that this will happen again if we don't, curb social degeneracy, try to, go back to banning LGBTQ rights, back to, restricting birth control. He never made a specific case for what he thought needed to be changed, but obviously I don't agree with this at all. I don't in any way believe that the United States in its modern form is comparable to Weimar Germany, other than one thing, and that is that there is kind of a divide between the political leaders within the U.S. and the majority of the population, and that goes for both liberals and conservatives. And that was one thing in Weimar Germany that's not going too far to say. That I agree with Whatifalthist on. There was a divide between the political elite within Germany at that time and the majority of the population, but that's because essentially their political elite had been somewhat crafted for them by the Allies. They really had not chosen that system, at least not all entirely on their own. They'd had it somewhat partially strong-armed by the Allies after the end of World War I. And that's totally different than the U.S. We still are, for the most part, calling the shots in our own election. I know there's conspiracy theories about other countries being involved, but at the end of the day, for the most part, the U.S., it's an autonomous country still. In fact, we play probably more of a role in other countries' elections than they do in ours. But anyways, no, the United States is not similar to Weimar Germany in most regards. Other than, I believe, like I said, there is a disconnect between some of the people and maybe some political leaders. And additionally, I do believe that, well, actually, just to quickly expand on that point a little, what I mean, in case those of you were wondering what I mean by divide between the political leaders and the people, look at our two top politicians right now in the United States, Joe Biden and Donald Trump. They're widely disliked by this country. Most people can't believe those two managed to get up to this level of power in the first place, including myself. And it's mostly because Trump, in his case, he has a small but very committed body of supporters that will stick by him throughout everything. And really, there aren't that many others, there aren't very many other leaders that have that within the Republican or Democratic Party, which is how Trump consolidated support. And on the Democratic side, Biden just is kind of a figurehead that represents the general leftist movements, but a lot of liberals don't really want him. He's just, the least offensive to a lot of different groups, so that's how he managed to come to power. Also just being familiar with people, being Obama's VP for 8 years. But there, I mean, there's incredibly low approval ratings of both Congress and the president in the United States, to the extent that you can tell people are incredibly dissatisfied. That doesn't mean it'll lead to a violent revolution or world war or a Hitler. In fact, I'm certain that a Hitler-type persona will almost certainly not come to power in the United States. Because if you look at modern U.S. thinking compared to Nazi ideology, there's just not even remotely comparable. I mean, I don't know. I'm not going to go into that now because that's a long spiel, but I strongly disagree with that. But yeah, ultimately, going back to my main point, I mean, what led to the rise of Hitler and, the fall of the Weimar Republic were, in probably, I believe, the order of importance. Number one, the losses Germany sustained from World War I. They were just absolutely enormous. Both loss of life, loss of political power, loss of economic power, and loss of, pride, loss of national pride. Number two, the Great Depression, that essentially started propelling Hitler in the elections from just a small minority, from just a small fringe, and the Nazis from a small fringe to being mainstream. And lastly, I believe some of just the many other factors that happened. I mean, Germans were not happy. Like the one I maybe slightly agree with Whatifalthist on, they were not really particularly ready or happy with democracy. And, some other things that people forget about, like the hyperinflation that plagued Germany for a while, and the many warring parties within Germany between the communists, the SA brown shirts. And one last factor, on that note about the chaos of Germany, I think a lot of Germans were also afraid of, leaders like Stalin, in the Soviet Union. I think they greatly feared potentially a takeover from him as well. I mean, I don't know if it would have happened or not, but Stalin was feared and detested by the entire West, including Germany. So just one last factor on that that's not necessarily, I think, comparable to the modern US and how Weimar Germany is different. But anyways, it might be a little bit of a topic that some people wonder why I choose, but like I said, I'm currently, reading or listening to an audiobook about Hitler's early years, and I just recently watched the movie Hitler: Rise of Evil, and I think with Whatifalthist making this video, it made it a very good time for me to react to it. So as usual, just thanks for watching, and see you next time. Bye.